Hello, welcome to Galactic Initiative. I'm your host, Jeff. George Lucas discussion part 2. Joining me again, Grand Admiral Sean. Welcome, Sean.
Hello, my friend.
Welcome, Robert.
Hello.
Talked in the first part of our discussion about Lucas, the storyteller. Let's open part 2 with a discussion of George Lucas, the writer. A lot of criticism has been leveled at George over the years. What's your assessment of him as a writer?
I'd say my assessment of George Lucas as a writer is very close to his own assessment of himself as a writer. It's like he's not a great writer by any stretch of the imagination. And I think, he's always known that. A lot of his work is like he's great at getting like the broad strokes down and getting an idea. But every indication is that it's a painful process for him. It's like a lot of writers, it's like, I enjoy having written much more than I've ever enjoyed writing. A lot of his stuff is about revision. He doesn't go into a movie with a finished script, even as far back as A New Hope. It seems like there were, changes being made in production. He figured out that, and I think it was Marcia may have suggested, and this might be apocryphal, that Obi-Wan doesn't seem to have a lot to do with the last third of the movie. Maybe you should kill him off, that kind of stuff. So as an actual writer, my assessment of him is not great. He's a visual guy, and words are not his way of telling a story to be ultimately, but you have to turn in a script, and he had a very specific way he wanted to do it. So it's that kind of catch-22. It's like he's not a great writer, but I don't think there's anybody else that could have written the bulk of the screenplay. He leaned on Willard Hayek and Gloria Katz a lot for dialogue, but I guess he started the Star Wars or whatever. He started like in 1972. And it didn't film until 1976. He was revising that story even through the production. So I think that's kind of my assessment of like, I don't even think he thinks of himself as a writer.
There's been interviews and things where George has talked about how it's sort of his least favorite process in the process. I think also, though, being self-aware enough to realize that his dialogue or the things that he's writing need that revision, and his ability or willingness to, on one hand, accept input and criticism, and being self-critical as well. There's so many artists and creatives that have such a high opinion of whatever it is that they're doing that they refuse any kind of input. Early on in George's film writing career, I think his writing was painful for him, and writing was his least favorite thing. And then I think I mentioned in the last show, there was some moments there when he was in film school where he would fight with the professors in the scripting class and saying, you don't need this, it's visual art, and I'm this visual artist, and you don't have to have words. And then of course he winds up writing movies and doing traditional movie making, but he's clearly uncomfortable doing it. At least early on, and even later on, and as we get to talk about the prequels and whatnot, it seems almost traumatic for him. Like when he's sitting down to write the prequels, and he's there in his office, and he looks pretty depressed. Here I am about to launch this journey of creating the next installment in my saga, and he just looks like the kid that you told he can't go play ball with his friends because he's got to mow the yard. Like, he just has that look on his face, like, man, this is gonna suck. So what the quality of the work that we get out of him. As the movies move forward, dialogue becomes, I guess, better in the original trilogy, and again, that's a lot of people with input into his work, and others writing some of the dialogue based on his story notes. I think thematically, he is a good writer, but the dialogue is kind of where that's sort of his Achilles heel when it comes to his creative process. Like, he's just sort of, you listen to him talk, you listen to him do interviews. Early on in his career, he's not very comfortable even speaking or having these conversations about stuff. He seems a little awkward and whatnot. And so it kind of translates into his writing. I've read enough about the writing process and interviews with authors and things about how people are like, oh, you just write what you know, write what you know. And what George Lucas knows is kind of awkward communication and weird introverted kind of experiential stuff. And so trying to create characters that are expressive and emotional and relatable is probably hard for him, especially, well, at least in the dialogue department. Of course, that famous quote, I believe it was from Harrison Ford, who said, you can write this stuff, or maybe it was Carrie Fisher, but, you can write this stuff, but you can't say it. I can see Lucas, his problems that he had with trying to come up with a language or coming up with casual conversation regarding things that we have no reference for in the galaxy far, far away, probably added an extra layer of difficulty to an already difficult process.
I was thinking of kind of a section in the one of the early biographies of George Lucas, which I actually would recommend people who are interested seeking out. It's not in print anymore. The Skywalking the Life and Films of George Lucas by Dave Pollock. And I was like, I had to look it up because I thought, oh, maybe this is apocryphal as well. But apparently, according to this book, he had this weird tendency to like sit in front of because he wrote longhand on legal pads. And when he'd become frustrated, he would take a pair of scissors and he would take a little chunk of his own hair and cut it off. And he would do this, and then like his assistant would see that he had a wastebasket full of like hair clippings, and she thought, was like, is he like his hair falling out? So it's just that thing of like, he apparently just hated writing so much, but he was like, how else am I going to get these ideas out? And it became like this just torturous process, which again makes me wonder why he didn't. Well, I mean, he did for Empire. He did hire a screenwriter, but there was all kinds of other issues with that. He's creating the whole cloth. At least with Star Trek, they could kind of use a whole team of people, but they come out with the broad strokes, and they would just literally write, like Ronald D. Moore for Star Trek, he would just write tech the tech, and then they'd go to another group, and then they would put in the tech, and then that they didn't have to even worry about that aspect of it. And George probably could have benefited from something like that.
Yeah, separating the writing from the ideas, the conception, the themes. So in the first part of our discussion, finally getting a deal to make the film. Let's talk about the mythos and the inspiration. Many, many shows have been dedicated to this. We could dedicate a full show to it. What stands out in terms of these things inspired George?
It's funny because as time goes on, it becomes evident how much stuff influenced George. I mean, again, the original pulps like Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Princess of Mars, when they finally made John Carter, Disney made John Carter, The Desert Planet, the Banth, which is a name of an animal in the Edgar Rice Burroughs, and the Banthas, and not even just the names, it's just the kind of the operatic storytelling, the high adventure, giving up the science part of the science fiction, maintaining the aesthetic. It's kind of like, in some ways, Dune is very, very was a huge influence on Lucas, although I've never actually heard him speak much about that, mainly because I think early on, I think there was a lawsuit that didn't go very far. So I think he's always been kind of hesitant to speak on that. But I mean, obviously a lot of people talk about the hero's journey, and I don't know where in the process he became kind of this devotee of the hero with 1,000 faces. But it's a lot of that stuff was almost post the original Star Wars, that he actually started going deeper into that after he'd already made it. And of course, since that stuff is kind of universal, it was influencing him even if he didn't know what it was called. I think of that generation of, the Spielberg, Coppola, and De Palma, that era of the Southern California directors or whatever. A lot of them, borrowed so very liberally from the things that they liked. I mean, but De Palma was very much accused of kind of being, a Johnny-come-lately Alfred Hitchcock. And, maybe he didn't have the same kind of like direct filmmaking techniques. Kurosawa was a big influence, but, it wasn't like he was trying to do a thematic thing through film. But the storytelling, it was very much this amalgamation of stuff that would be commonly viewed as greasy kid stuff, things that were silly, pulp, stuff that was made to be consumed on a Saturday with popcorn for a nickel amongst 10 other short serial things, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, all these things. And they were just meant to be never to be thought about again. And I think one of the great things about the way Lucas was able to kind of tap into these things, I think he realized that they were valuable. And if somebody could kind of take the trappings of those serial pulp type science fiction, high adventure, and tap into the universality of it, that somehow you would kind of like break the code. And I think and I don't know how intentional, if that's what it was, or he just had a thing of like, I'd really like to try that because it would be interesting to try to do it. Or maybe it was an ultimate goal of like, I really want to show people that there was more to those stories all along. It's kind of a little bit of both. Because, again, a lot of his initial impetus for writing this was that he couldn't get the rights to Flash Gordon, much like Indiana Jones was the fact that he couldn't get the rights to James Bond. And so it's that kind of balance of like, well, why don't I just make it up all myself? Well, how are these things made? And I think that's when you go to these, what do these things all have in common? And maybe it's because he'd had an adolescence where he consumed a lot of that stuff. I've never heard him speak of like, I read Herman Melville and I really liked, literature. And I think he was kind of he was a product of what he consumed, and he consumed a lot of pulp, and, that's kind of the bedrock of because like, I can speak in this language because I know this language, because this is what I was steeped in. And I think ultimately he knew that was his pathway forward to telling this story, whether or not he was thinking of a saga from the get-go. There's always been these conversations about like really how big was the initial conception of Star Wars. He says, it was 12 movies. It was 9 movies. It was just one big movie. I think there was kind of like a master arc that he had, and he's been kind of picking names from it. But the storytelling, I don't think he'd had that so figured out from the get-go. I think it was mostly a style of storytelling more than anything.
I would agree with that. And I would add that, I don't think George Lucas ever really had this epic plan to tell a grand tale of political allegory to talk about the world as it was, while he was in college. There's a lot of wish fulfillment going on there, I think, with a lot of people in Hollywood and people who are literary critics and, kind of pushing their own stuff onto a lot of these films. Now, again, the universality of themes, this is why Nostradamus' predictions are so wonderful, is because they're so vague that you can lay them over anything that's going on in your life and go, see, it was real. And I think that the topics of the original Star Wars film, and then ultimately that stretched through the original trilogy, is anybody can recognize the conversation regarding, tyranny and oppression and freedom and good and evil and all that kind of stuff. Again, universal themes are universal for a reason, right? They apply to everyone. Now, whether the fight against tyranny is colonialism or war, or the guy at your local restaurant, won't give you Catalina Island dressing because that's his thing, right? Whatever your version of tyranny is, you can find the meaning in that movie. My position as a rebel is I rebel against people who have to stand in line at the bank, or I'm rebelling against this massive oppressive corporate military industrial kind of thing going on. Whatever you want it to be. The Campbell thing was something that George figured out. It almost rescued him in a way, because George, when he started writing all this stuff, it was, and we don't know, was it supposed to be 12 films or whatever, but if you look at some of the original drafts of the story that he felt were ready to be reviewed or critiqued or edited or whatnot, I mean, there is a lot of stuff that shows up in Empire and Return of the Jedi that's in that, and there's a lot of different characters or characters that are combined that get split out or changed through the various edits and revisions. It was a large thing, and it was very convoluted. And I think that the arrival of Campbell in his life through the Hero of a Thousand Faces was a way for him to be like, okay, this is the plot line, or this is the through path that I need to follow. And so if I can start rearranging the pieces on the chessboard, so to speak, I can make my story fit into this arc, and then the arc can be part of a larger arc, which is something that Campbell also talks about in the book, is that the cycles. George likes to talk about, it's like poetry. You've got, you got verses and repeated stuff, and it's like, the beats. And he always talks about the beats, which is very much a product of late 60s Southern California. But Campbell talks about there's the cycle, but the cycle is repetitive, and the cycle can be a part of a larger cycle. And so I think that is what kind of clarified Lucas's idea about the movie. And he's often talked about, I sheared off a huge section of my story, and I made one that could be self-contained if it had to, but also left things open for me to continue if it was successful. And again, I don't think he ever had this grand vision to tell us a story of mid-70s America and what it means to be a young person in the Nixon era and the post-Nixon era and, all that stuff. George consumed a lot of popular culture. He's not that he's not a deep thinker, but I don't ever think he was a deep academic. I don't think he really spent a lot of time steeped in literature and things of that nature. I think that he was aware of media, film, popular culture, television, the stuff that was important to him as a kid in the 60s. And he wanted to make a thing that made him happy. And I don't know if that's the right phrase, but he loved all this stuff as a kid. He loved the Flash Gordon, and he loved all that. That had no real, in the grand scheme of things, had no real value culturally, other than the fact that it was a moment in time and an installment in the science fiction genre and all these things. And it's what made him happy. It's like us, right? We love Star Wars as a kid. It makes us happy. We constantly return to it. We want to see more of it. We love it, right? And I think for George, it was a lot of the same. Yes, as a person who wanted to be successful in Hollywood and make his money and do all these things, he saw some of those franchises like Bond and Flash Gordon as things that he could take and recreate. But I also think that George is very much aware of his image and his reputation, and has been cultivating that for a long time, as we see over years where interviews, he'll be asked the same question in interviews over a 30-year span, and the answer always changes, and it gets refined, and it gets honed into, showing himself as that simple guy who just makes movies. But I don't think he really sat down to say, I'm going to make an allegory of the Vietnam War, and it's going to happen in space, and I'm going to call it Star Wars. And, the rebels, or, the Viet Cong, are going to be a dog and a couple of kids, and they're going to go blow up this thing, which is a symbol of American military. I don't think that never crossed his mind. He's also picking and choosing and assimilating the praise for his films, and he's repackaging that. So, when we do the 50th anniversary interview with George Lucas about Star Wars or whatever, he's going to be like, well, yeah, it's just about Nam and blah, 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 And so I really just think it was him trying to do something that made him happy. And the great irony of all that is that when it was all done and he got suffered through the making of this process, and then all the studios and all the fans are clamoring for more and more and more, it ceased being something fun for him and something that made him happy.
When he talks about the Roman Empire, the British Empire, what he perceives as the American Empire, Nixon as the emperor, you almost sound skeptical. Are you suggesting what others see in it, he's just kind of going with that?
I think so. I mean, so George Lucas, by his own admission, as a child and as a young adult, really didn't care about anything other than cars and movies. He never really talks about how he was this deep consumer of history and historiography and like all these things. Like these are things that he probably had to be exposed to in college because, we all have our undergraduate requirements, right? Freshman year, you got to take history and whatever. I'm sure he was exposed to those things, but I don't think that really informed him until the Campbell situation. Because Campbell talks about, the Hero of a Thousand Faces talks about the monomyth. And he goes and he looks at myths and legends in cultures all over the globe. In deep history, right? The distant past. And he says, well, look at these myths. There's always a creation myth. And all the creation myths are about the same when you boil them down to their core elements. Forget about the names of the people involved and all this other stuff. It's usually there's some almighty being that's out there in the ether, and then there is a thing, some kind of catalyst, and then stuff is created, and it's generally about a week, and then humans are created, and this is where we come from. And then he lists it all out, and then he says, oh yeah, and then there's the princess in distress myth that every culture has, and he boils it all down. He's like, yep, somebody's there. He has to go on this quest and save this person from a tormentor, and then it usually ends up in some kind of romance and whatever, right? And he goes through like all these myths and he breaks them down. It's almost like on a spreadsheet. Core element right here, that kind of breakdown of storytelling is something that hit George Lucas in a couple of different ways. One, it helped him tidy up the scattering of just craziness that was his original draft of Star Wars, but also too it allowed him an opportunity to reflect on history, and maybe at that point he came to the fact of like, okay, well, the meta myth of revolution, right? There's always an oppressor and there's always an oppressed, and there's always some kind of fight for freedom and whatnot that is involved in that. And then maybe he started putting some labels on that, but again, those interviews where he starts talking about Roman Empire and the British Empire, that stuff is 20 years after the movie came out. You don't really start hearing him talk about, well, yeah, it was an allegory of Vietnam until way later. But again, you're also talking about a guy who tried to join the military so again, Lucas's life is full of contradictions. His various interviews, if you go and read original content over the course of his life, his answers are always changing. And so it's not that I don't trust George, but I just don't. There's something there where he feels like he's almost a chimera, and he just changes himself to fit the situation or to make himself look the best and maybe come off as a little more intellectual than he really is, because deep down he's just a nerd and he's making nerd stuff. And I think he's always deep down has tried to seek some kind of affirmation and acceptance. And this goes all the way back to him as being an outsider, being a car guy, and like not really being a part of, the popular crowd or the athletes or any of that stuff. And I think that when famous or, well-respected people come to him and say, your film just reminded me of the struggles in the 60s of the counterculture against the establishment, and, and he's like, yeah, totally. That's totally where I was at. Yeah. You're so smart for figuring that out. These relationships, benefit him and they also legitimize his work. And so I think that, I wouldn't say distrust is the word, but I think that as we've seen through his actions as a filmmaker and as a businessman, he's a very shrewd individual.
I would agree with that 100%. I've always kind of felt that a lot of that is a certain level of insecurity with George Lucas, of like not necessarily maybe the company he kept at the time, and you talk about your ideas. You're like, well, I just want to make something that reminds me of the stuff that excited me as a kid. When your best friend at the time is Francis Ford Coppola, who's like, oh, we need to take this Joseph Conrad novel and I actually don't know when the Apocalypse Now, because I know George was actually involved in that to a certain extent. But, you know, it's, again, a lot of high-minded literary type of things. And then if you want to go like, yeah, I really want to do something that's going to appeal to 12-year-olds, it's a little kind of hard. It's a hard sell amongst your peer group unless you're kind of like, well, and, you know, and then so like the bad guy is Nixon and kind of, and, you know, and it's like, oh, yeah, man, that sounds cool. Yeah. And it's flattering when people find depth in something, when you were just really trying to just create something actually very simple that doesn't have a lot of layers to it. And then inadvertently you actually create something that does have layers. I'm not saying that Star Wars doesn't have layers to it. It's just that kind of, I don't think the intent was there per se. And it's a lot of this flattery type of thing in your peer group. And again, go back to the initial screening of, so the film's already been made and the effects aren't done, and or maybe they are mostly done, and then he goes and screens them to his peer group, which is Coppola and De Palma and all that, and they all kind of groan. And who's the only guy that came and said, oh, I really love it, is Spielberg, who basically is very much like George in the idea that he doesn't mind playing to the child within the viewer, and ultimately that was enough for millions of people that enjoy it. Talking to Star Wars fans, I don't really hear, the hero's journey will come up, but that's not people who are like, I really love Star Wars because it taps into that hero's journey and it's a metaphor for our times. No, they really enjoy the story. Again, back to the Dave Pollock book, he, in the early 80s, he started kind of taking this pitch of like, oh, I'm just a simple filmmaker trying to create, he's always trying to mythologize himself, because I think if he admitted, it's like, I just want to make something that makes others as excited as I was when I was 9 years old.
The biggest thing that he probably should have done, well, I shouldn't say if he does it, he probably winds up not being as popular and wonderful and making all of his money and all that stuff. But there is a lack of, there's a in society, I guess there's a lack of being okay with being happy or doing things because they're fun. Right? We always have to feel like we're doing something, right? Or the big capital S something. We have to be, commenting politically, or we have to be doing good for our fellow man, or we have to be aware of our actions and how they impact the universe and all sort of stuff. And it's like, it's become taboo or frowned upon for us to just say, you know what, I just wanted to check out for a couple hours and have a good time and take this, roller coaster ride through the galaxy and blow stuff up or whatever, right? It's becoming more and more, this attitude is more and more oppressive in our current day. I mean, it probably was beginning in the Vietnam era and the cultural awareness of, all this stuff and counterculture and the battle in the streets of America at that time. And if George had, fashioned himself as like, I'm the guy that's going to make people reconnect with their youthful, joy and happiness and all those things, like, he could have had just as much cultural significance that way as he has carved out for himself now, that sort of got handed to him by PBS one afternoon.
Now he's ready to make Star Wars. So he's wearing many, many different hats at the time: writer, director, head of studio. Let's talk about his experiences with A New Hope.
Well, it's a miracle, really. I mean, we again, this is something that Robert and I have talked about in the past on the Dude Show, and I've mentioned probably on this podcast several times, is that filmmaking is this very strange, very complex and difficult process. And to get a finished film completed and distributed is almost like an act of God, because there's so much that can go wrong. And there's so many things when it comes to just getting the movie greenlit in the first place, to get the funding and the financing from the studios, and then, having to go through casting and script revisions and all this other stuff, and location scouting and filming on location, all these things. And there's just so much stuff that does and can go wrong. And we've heard some of the spectacular stories about that in Hollywood. And Star Wars New Hope is no different. I mean, we had a situation where George wanted to film it in California, but none of the studios had sound stages big enough for him to build the set. So he went to England and then wound up at Elstree. And then there was the whole problems with that, because now we have this cultural difference between the workforce there and this American director and his ideas of filmmaking in Hollywood. And it was nothing that he was familiar with. And we had all the stories about the unions over there and voting on whether or not they were going to work. And they all had a very short work day, and they had their tea breaks and all stuff. And, George here is this crazy artist, auteur, director, and he's in the middle of a scene. Everybody just turns off all the lights and says, "Yep, tea time." And they're like, "We were right in the middle of filming that. You can't do that." And they're like, "Nope, it's in the contract. Sorry." And he was on a short, shooting schedule anyway. And there was all kinds of budget issues and overruns and cost. And the Elstree experience was very difficult for him in a lot of ways. And then they built all these sets in Tunisia, and there was storms and weather issues, and it tore a lot of it up, and they have to rebuild, and delays again, and all this stuff. And then the fact that he had to create this whole company, Industrial Light and Magic, the building of the computer operated cameras that they were using, and the model shop and all this stuff, took a huge amount of his budget just to get it set up and get it running. And after he had finally finished a lot of this on location shooting, he goes down to these guys and he's like, "Okay, well, where are my special effects shots? Where's the stuff?" And they're like, "We haven't even started that yet." So these things could have at any given moment derailed this production completely and killed it. And if it wasn't for George's will, this stuff kind of really, it got pulled together and became the film that it was. And yes, there's a lot of people involved, and there's a lot of people who came in sort of at the last minute. We talked about Spielberg believing in him when he showed the rough cut, and of course Marcia with her last minute editing of the film to make it pace better and move more like an action film as opposed to something else. There's a lot of stuff that happened during the making of this movie that could have killed it all. I mean, Alan Ladd kept holding the board of 20th Century Fox at bay. They kept demanding that the movie be released now, and there's no more money for it and all these things. And he kind of came back to George and was like, "Look, I can get you a little extra money to finish this thing off, but you have to be done by a certain date." And George was like, "There's no way we can do that." And he's like, "No, you really don't understand. If it's not done by this date, if we can't go back to the board and say principal photography is done on this day, this thing's never getting made." There's all these conversations that were going on, all these problems, all these pitfalls, and there's movies that we've read about that never made it that far, and they had similar problems. I mean, there's the Nicolas Cage Superman movie, for example, that was never made, but got to the whole point of pre-production and costume design and script and all that stuff, and there's a lot of money invested in that movie, and who knows what it could have been or what it ultimately would have turned out to be, but it never got the chance. And so for this movie to have not just one problem, but have multiple problems on the various levels of whether it's day-to-day practical filming or whether it's location issues or financing, or the guys at ILM blowing the budget to build a bunch of cameras and that didn't even get used until much later in the process. This thing probably never should have happened. And the fact that it did, I mean, is a testament to a lot of people's tenacity, and not the least of which is George Lucas.
So how successful is Lucas in each of the different roles that he has to play? The famous story about getting the rights to the merchandise, getting distribution and the financing and things like that. For The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, he will not be the director. More of a personal choice at that point, obviously based on the success of A New Hope. But do we look at him as, I mean, Sean used the word shrewd. how shrewd was he in negotiating?
Well, I would say he was probably a little shrewder than we give him credit for, because he didn't make any money off of THX, but he did become a millionaire from American Graffiti. He didn't go crazy. I think they bought a house, and apparently his one indulgence was he bought himself a jukebox, which he kind of loaded with a lot of these singles that he liked when he was a teenager. People say that's apparently the story is that when he would write, he'd write a page or something of Star Wars, and then he would allow himself to listen to music. It was never like, oh, I can listen to music while I work on my Star Wars. It was like, no, you have to write, and then you can have your music. So we already kind of know that's where writing sits in with him. And then we have his directing. And it's, again, the story and thing. It's, he goes, like Sean said, he goes to Tunisia, and the weather is terrible. And first time they'd ever had a storm like that in North Africa in like 50 years. And it happens. And again, it doesn't happen again for another 25 years or whatever when he's in there again filming. So it's like a lot. Anytime anything that could kind of jam you up and make you want to walk away happened. I mean, he goes to England, and again, the crew doesn't like him. They didn't respect the material. They thought this was like, something akin to a Doctor Who episode or something that was going to be cheaply made and thrown out to drive-ins or whatever. So he wasn't every indication he's not a charismatic person on set. He's very meek. He's very quiet. Probably his whole communication was necessitated by the fact that monitoring wasn't what it was now, where it's like you film and then you didn't really know how the shot looked until it came back from the lab the next day and you watch the dailies and then you go, okay, well, we can move on. So, like as time went on, it's like it became, you can watch the shots on a monitor right away. And then he's like, I don't need to talk to anybody. So a lot of it is like, I think he quickly realized that, yes, he definitely he is a director. It's like but he's not a director in the John Ford sense of it. He's not the director in the, even in the Steven Spielberg sense. His version of directing is directing the production. Yes, he has shots he wants. He knows how he wants the film to look. Well, ultimately, I mean, in the time when films kind of had to look like the way they were shot, not prequel era when he could literally move people to different parts of the frame via computer. But at the time, he had to know what he wanted. And I think he quickly realized, if I'm just the guy sitting behind the cinematographer making, going action cut, that this is not going to get done the way I want it to, because I need to be ultimately pulling the strings on everything all the time. Maybe he's not a director in the sense that, okay, I could direct, and then like he could ever direct somebody else's work, even somebody he trusted. I think, he was never going to be the type of director that could pick up a couple $1 million like Francis did, like, making essentially The Godfather. First Godfather was not what Francis Ford Coppola wanted to make, but it was money in hand and he knew he could do it. I don't think George could do that. I don't think George could have ever said like, well, I'm just going to, I need to build my ranch, so I'm going to direct like, a Jaws 3 and a couple of movies, and not even from the fact that it would, maybe cheapen him. I just don't think that's technically the artist he is. So ironically, for a guy who just kind of wanted to make this greasy kid stuff and try to make it to a broader audience, I think at a certain point, even though I've never really read a lot of stuff about what his experiences were with his father, I think there had to be some business savvy that had come either through osmosis or from, direct lessons that his father told him growing up. Essentially, if I'm not mistaken, Star Wars was budgeted at like maybe $9 million. And it ballooned to 11, and he had to fight for, a better cantina scene, which ultimately he wasn't satisfied. I think on a certain level, he had to advocate to finish the effects for the final battle, the Death Star, because some people at the studio had said, well, you saved the princess, you left. Essentially, you could just end it right here. You don't need this final battle. You could just do a crawl at the end and said that our mighty rebels defeated the Empire, used the plans, and blew up the Death Star. You don't need to show it, and we could save all this money. And he pushed for it. I think Alan Ladd was an advocate because he believed in him. Lucas also knew that he wanted it. Once he had gotten into this, once they had started rolling film, I think that's when it really became this idea that, like, well, I do want to make these. I want to finish this story. This is, I don't know. It's like, they talk so much about that thing of him being kind of sullen and in England and having chest pains and thinking that he was going to have a heart attack at 28 and just the amount of stress that he was in. But, he got the movie done. I don't know. I'm not denying that stuff happened, but there's a bit of it that makes you wonder. It's like, really, was it? Because hear now it's first big feature for a relatively the same age director. Use Josh Trank, who was supposed to make a Boba Fett movie for Kathy Kennedy and got fired because he couldn't finish a Fantastic Four movie that just got wildly out of control on his second feature. And it's, that isn't in every indication that Star Wars, you're literally inventing technology, you're inventing companies, you're coming up with a whole new way of storytelling, at least in this movie. It's like you're elevating something that used to be made on the fly in warehouses in Van Nuys or whatever into this high art, $11 million production. And he's still, negotiating for toy rights and licensing rights. And it's like, he had to have known that at some point that was it was either going to be worth nothing or it was going to pay huge dividends to him. Lucas kind of understanding this need for mythology of storytelling tapped into this whole idea of the mythology of the filmmaker. And again, I don't know if I doubt it was intentional, but it's that he's very good at synthesis. And on some level, he immediately, again, like they had a making of Star Wars documentary out very soon after Star Wars came out, which again, that's, that EPK electronic press kit stuff, those things were being made at that time, but generally it was a 15-minute thing that they would plop on and they maybe show it at a convention in the back room, and again, that's how, and George would promote Star Wars through conventions. And the idea of getting somebody, I don't know if it was Charles Lippincott or whoever it was, but would take these, either it wasn't Star Wars itself, but he would take like kind of a reel to Star Wars and show like what was in progress and get people hyped about it. So yes, he talks about like, I just need to get my movie made, but I honestly think that there was no danger that Star Wars wasn't going to get made, well, at least on his end. Fox was wavering in their belief in the project, and there was some talk about dumping it on as a TV movie and kind of cutting their losses. But I don't know how far that really went. I don't know if that was maybe as a way to leverage Lucas. There was some aspect of it where he did kind of give up some financial, personal compensation to kind of finish the film, but not licensing wise, but just in the actual director's fee. But I think that really kind of solidified that he didn't want this to happen again, where he was figuring out stuff and then a corporation has an opinion. So I think that's when George decided, I'm going to become the corporation. ILM, I mean, he created a corporation with the money that he got to make the film. And I don't think Fox was going to own that regardless. So it's like, well, I can use these effects and then I can make stuff for television and kind of pay the bills, and it can be self-sustaining. So he quickly realized everything that he wanted to say as a director in the traditional sense, he kind of said in his first 3 films. He realized that the real power is in the production aspects. Obviously, he hired Irvin Kershner ostensibly because he knew him and he respected him. And then later on realized, well, that's good and that's not good, because he wasn't happy with some aspects. He wanted more of somebody that was more moldable, and that's why he ended up with Richard Marquand. So as a director, like I said, I think this is the beginning of him as a mogul, but in his own way. It's not in the the guys that he complained about when he was first starting out, that all these old like Jack Warners and the I forget who was some of the people that ran Fox. A lot of these people, it was this dying breed, and it's like I think he saw the value in that, but didn't want to be those guys. And so it's like he kind of did it his own way. It's like he's the controlling all aspects, but was still in the trenches of the thing. So it's like that line blurs. Like, well, okay. So because people still to this day think that he directed all the Star Wars movies. People don't generally know who Irvin Kershner is or Marquand. So it's like, I think this is when he kind of began the mystique. I just don't know how intentional it was.
The one other thing, I think the big things that George did, right? So the being a director and a producer and a studio head, for Lucasfilm, et cetera, and creating ILM and all that stuff, we can give him high marks on that because we saw the product initially, or we saw the making of the product, and we saw him overcoming obstacles and ultimately achieving and succeeding. Even if the movie had flopped and fallen apart and nobody had ever went to go see it, he got it done. Okay, and that's the first step, right? That's the first achievement. He made it happen. Okay, great. Now, the way it hit in the theaters and the way it resonated with humanity, it's not just the American public. It's a global phenomenon. That was never guaranteed. It was that luck. Who knows? Was it? What was that? Why did that happen? I saw the movie as a child. I thought it was the greatest thing, and I still watch it all the time. So clearly, it hit with people and it sticks with people. So is that the byproduct of his work and others' work? Yes, of course. But we never really know how movies are going to hit, whether they're going to become a phenomenon or not. We talked about, Blade Runner 2049, not a major success at the box office, yet very well received and highly respected by the nerds and the people who are fans of that franchise, right? So just because something is great doesn't mean that it was necessarily recognized as being great in real time when it was released. It might take time for people to watch it several times or to come back to it later and to appreciate it for what it is. So George got very lucky in the fact that not only was it an instant success, it also had longevity as something that people continued to return to and enjoy. The thing where I think George was wildly lucky, which now of course looks like genius, right? It's like going for it on fourth down, right? Like everybody says you're a genius of a coach when it succeeds, but when it doesn't work and you turn the ball over and you lose the game, everybody calls you stupid. But was his reliance on the merchandising, saying to the studio, oh yeah, I'll give up a little bit of this here and there, but I want full merchandising rights. And up to that point, merchandising was not a thing. You could sell a few lunch boxes, but there wasn't a lot of merchandising. At the time, the only products or the only franchises that had any success beyond just again the lunch boxes and the t-shirts or whatever, the Planet of the Apes franchise and Star Trek, and they were actually selling action figures and having stuff in the Sears catalog at Christmas, and there was repeat purchases of that stuff. It wasn't just like, oh, a movie comes out, it's out for the summer, you sell a few things to the kids, and then by next summer it's the next thing. Like those were the only two franchises that were having repeat sales. So by George really hanging his hat on merchandising, that was kind of leaving it up to the whim of whatever happens with the public and how they receive this film. he also was very prolific in his merchandising. He threw out the opportunity for everybody to put Star Wars on anything because he got money. And then over the years, he became a little more circumspect with that. And, you weren't getting awkward C-3PO tape dispensers and stuff like that. But he really said, like, I'm going to make money on this. I'm going to make a little bit on distribution. I'm going to make a little bit on the box office. But I'm going to make all of my money on this other stuff. That could have gone horribly wrong for him as well. And I think that was, of all the things that he did or planned for or executed while making this film, I think that was the one that was probably the luckiest and was totally out of his control. Just because, again, that's fully reliant on the audience and the audience's, response to his film. And the fact that he became a multimillionaire off of action figure sales and posters and like all that stuff, flashlights that were supposed to be lightsabers, all that junk that went on with Star Wars, like that's where he really started to make his money, and ultimately allowed him to finance and do the rest of the trilogy the way he wanted to, with full control over everything. But the fact that he finished the film, to me, shows that he's successful as a director, writer, producer, studio head, because by having Lucas fill all those roles at the same time, it reduced the amount of external influence. And ultimately, we're going to see down the line, when it comes to the prequels, that creates its own problems. But initially in that moment, and when Star Wars New Hope was made, by wearing all those hats, that's enough to break most people. And ultimately he did have some health problems and things like that. But, the fact that he held it together is I would say that counts as a major success.
He's a fast learner. You mentioned his learning curve in the first part of the discussion. So the experiences that he'd had to this point, he puts to good use. I'm wondering how much of the success in just finishing the film comes from some of the amazing people that he had around him.
Well, I think Marcia was obviously she was a replacement for somebody that had been originally Lucas fired, because he had some issues with crew. It wasn't all a slam dunk right out of the gate. Obviously, he had issues with John Dykstra, who was his head of special effects, and he notoriously had a feud with Gilbert Taylor, who was his cinematographer. He was not happy with, I forget what it was. It was like they wanted opposite things, and I think they ended up kind of coming to a compromise. So, a lot of it is kind of my theory, which, whatever that's based on, is that a lot of this idea that, Star Wars was 100% saved in the edit. I don't know how true that is, in the idea that it was saved in the edit as an external thing to George Lucas, that Marcia that came in and saved it. He definitely was an editor himself. It's just, I think at a certain point, when you're that deep into a production and you're trying to get stuff done timeline, I just don't think he could physically do it. And Marcia was obviously an award-winning person and had firsthand knowledge of what George was shooting for. So she had the talent and the ability to probably interpret what he wanted. So in some ways you could make an argument that maybe she at that point, she was an aspect of kind of his will of the production. So he could kind of work on other things. I don't think it was a situation where, he was going to release some ridiculous piece of film that nobody would want to watch, and these three editors were able to kind of save it. But that being said, there are little things that you can kind of tell. A long time ago, I think it's on the Blu-ray, one of the Blu-ray sets, you can watch kind of some early assembly cuts of the cantina sequence that were more drawn out. Like Han Solo had a girlfriend that was sitting with, you were seeing Han Solo, and it was bouncing around, and it kind of got murky and stuff. And I think a lot of that went out, but he was kind of lean and mean with some of his stuff too. It's like he didn't want that whole sequence with Biggs and Luke kind of early on, with him at Luke at the moisture evaporator and then going to Anchorhead. He didn't actually, it was as a concession to the studio that they just felt that he was taking too long to get his hero into the movie. So he ended up having to film a lot of stuff that I don't think he was super excited about using. So he was already mentally editing, and again, like I said, he was pushing back on them being like, hey, do we even need this battle at the end kind of situation? And he obviously knew, he already knew what it needed more so than the studio. He was obviously not the greatest manager or motivator because, of his kind of calm demeanor or his inability to kind of stand up until things had gotten to the point where, he had been in England and Africa for a long time and came back to like no actual usable work. And then maybe he had to start cracking heads at that point. But even then it was more of a thing of like, well, this just needs to be done. And the whole punitive aspects of it didn't even happen until later on when Dykstra didn't get points on the film, whereas a lot of other people did. And so it was kind of like this weird punishment or whatever. But yeah, again, it's not like he hadn't made any other movies. He'd made 2 other films that, if you look at the style of them, stylistically, it's not like it's like a completely different, obviously story wise it's very different, but stylistically, the use of sound, the use of impressionistic visuals to tell for storytelling. I mean, it's all there. It's, a lot of it is idea of like, well, how do you get this all done? And yeah, you have to learn to delegate. And I think maybe that's where this idea of, Lucas as like having to kind of get saved at the last minute came from, is because his poor ability to delegate until maybe things got to the point where it's like, well, either I break this off into smaller pieces and for other people, or I'm going to potentially not be able to finish it. I mean, he was doing audio mixing. I mean, there's the first run of the movie that, dependent on the aspect, if you went and saw the 35 versus the 70, it has a different audio mix. I mean, it wasn't like a thing where he got to the point of like, well, this is all I can do, so therefore now I have to kind of turn this over to people and they'll kind of fix it for me. So he was always in the trenches, but like, there's only so many things one person can do. And I think that's where a lot of this idea came from. And this is not to diminish the talents of the editors. I just think ultimately, if he didn't know what he wanted, those things wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I would say that the George is a good manager only in the sense that he recognizes talent and that he knows where to place that talent to be the most benefit to his mission. But at the same time, there is some of that controlling, not wanting to let go when it comes to the work. Some of the things are true, right? George put together a film. He was an editor. He edited a film. He had it to the point where he wanted it, and then he showed it to a bunch of people, and they all told him it was trash. And then, Marcia came in and saved the day, in air quotes, right? She did her version of it, and then it was much better. George still had to create all of the content that she stitched together. I think that maybe saying that she saved the film is a little hyperbolic. It's not untrue, but I think that the weight that it's given is, again, as we look back, and I think it's a little more, I don't know, I guess it's given a little more importance than it probably should, because it wasn't like there was a lot of deep fixes that she did. It was, again, we talked about a minor rearranging of the order of things and then trimming some scenes a little bit. So again, it speaks to the collaborative effort, and I think that George, the people that he had around him, the people that he tapped to create, ILM, and the people that he involved in the production process, especially when it came to art and design and the scoring of the film and all of that. It's it was these people bringing these things together. George has a very established reputation of being the guy. He sits there on the throne, and you come before him, and you show him the things, and then he selects the thing, or he says, "I want half of that thing with that half of that thing," and put it together and make the thing. So some of it is he has an idea in his mind, and he can't necessarily articulate it, but he has a process, and he knows that if he has the right people in the right places doing the right things, that process will work. And again, to the earlier comments, it could all go horribly wrong. But the fact is that he as a manager of that process had the right people there, so that when things did get sideways, he could rearrange the pieces on the chessboard and make it happen. And I think that to Robert's point, when George was pushed into the position of being the disciplinarian and being the boss, capital B, he reluctantly did that, but he would do it. He managed the process, and I think that ultimately the success that he got, or the praise, the success, and all the stuff, and all of the praise that's heaped upon him for this whole thing, I do feel like a lot of those people just think it's all George. Like, this whole thing was, there was one guy, and he did all this stuff, and he made this movie, and look at him, isn't he great? And that's not how the collaborative creative process of filmmaking works. So we need to recognize that, yes, he was a significant part of that and was responsible for a lot of it, but you can't forget about the people that surrounded him and ultimately made this thing a success.
With the success of A New Hope and Star Wars merchandise, Lucas's life completely changes. He becomes exceedingly wealthy. He creates the artistic freedom that he's always wanted. And when he negotiates for the next movie, because he's now going to turn Star Wars into a saga, into a franchise, he will have all the cards, and he can have the terms for distribution that he wants, and he's not going to be limited by anything other than the resources that he's willing to put into the movie. And obviously this is going to buck the Hollywood system. What changed? How did the business change? How did he set himself up to now make more Star Wars movies? Not to mention Indiana Jones. Lucasfilm will blow up. Talk, if you would, about how we go from the premiere of A New Hope to changing the entire Hollywood model.
In a lot of regards, I think that was the end of the version of George Lucas that was the long-suffering Lucas. It's like, oh, will this work? Will this won't work? And now he just knows definitively, because it was, Star Wars was like such a cultural thing. I don't know. At this point, to have something like that in 2021, you have to have like a war or or a natural disaster to take up that much oxygen in a room. I'm not saying it changed the way people lived or anything like that, but it changed the pop culture lexicon almost overnight, where it immediately became the lingua franca of the summer of 1977. It's in the Empire of Dreams documentary that came with the Blu-ray or the DVDs. They talked a lot. Bill Moyers talked a lot about how the Nixon thing, the Watergate, the Vietnam War, this idea of the anti-hero, the Dirty Harry, the Gene Hackman. These were the French Connection. This was the kind of movie, The Exorcist. People were dealing with heady, serious society's dark sides, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, there's pop music became very upbeat, and then this movie came up, and it just, so many people were just enjoying almost kind of a respite from, some very, very dark times. Not to say not that it was universal. There's definitely people that to this day go, oh, I hated that movie when it came out. And it's almost like I find those in some weird way. It's like it's interesting to talk to them about people that were around when that movie came out and that movie made no impression on them whatsoever, and to try to get their perspective. But there definitely was in the minority of people that were, of a certain age and enjoyed pop culture. But then again, it's like even grandparents had to kind of get hip with what was going on that summer. And it's weird. I guess it's that time. It's like TV and, pre-internet media, everything is kind of set to the same channel for, a summer. And that kind of carries on. And for a good 6-year run, just bringing up Star Wars in a story was going to get eyes on it because people were interested in it. Like, what's going to happen next? What's he going to do? And I think George kind of picked up on least on the aspect that now he was in the driver's seat of this, and that if he wanted to, he could have gone the aspect and given up a lot of control and have made an even larger, more expansive sequel with even more exotic sets and create cities and things like that, rather than just kind of going to these almost monochromatic backgrounds of snow, desert, and again Cloud City. But at the time, if we're being honest, look at it's very much a set. And he could have given up some control and gotten a bigger picture, but instead he goes, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go for broke, which is, people kind of think like, oh, of course, Star Wars is a success. Therefore, 20th Century Fox would have given him any amount of money he wanted. But the way that films were done, generally, sequels were the cheap knockoff of the thing. I mean, again, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was conceived, those contracts or whatever were, in the production, early days of the production of Star Wars, ostensibly because they thought, well, if it flops, we'll at least be able to kind of script up a made-for-TV movie version with a lot of the same actors and squeeze a little bit more money out of this thing, even if it is just a moderate hit. But, it's like Planet of the Apes was a surprise, and then the sequel, they cut the budget. And that's the thing. The Planet of the Apes movies, like every budget was half the budget of the movie preceding it, and then you end up with like three people in costume and like 35 really bad Halloween masks kind of fuzzy in the background. And I think that was something that he was probably afraid of. And he was like, if I let the studio control this, that's what we're going to get. It's either maybe we'll spend a lot of money, but they'll cut corners or they'll fight me on this. So he had to fund this. He basically took all of his money and then put it up and then got bank loans and got $40 million or something to make the sequel. So it's the irony. It's like it was the last time that he had to worry, but really not to be honest, he probably was worried during that whole production too, that if Fox had to come in and fund him at the last minute, and then he would ultimately lose that control, which is why he took the risk in the first place. So he hires somebody to write a script, and with his story input, of course, but ultimately he ends up having to kind of piecemeal a script together of Lee Brackett, and who passed away after turning in the first draft. And there's always been this conversation about how much of it was used, how much of her name being used in the production is the fact that he was actually a fan of hers, and it was a token of respect because she passed away before he could actually get a second draft out of it, and how much of it was taken. I've seen many discussions that go many different ways about who really was the impetus behind the story, but it is the beginning of a very different Lucas. There's an interview that in Starlog magazine I think it's from 1980 or right after it came back, but it was like almost this kind of different kind of posturing of his, where he kind of was already kind of getting annoyed with people's wanting to co-opt some of his success. And like he was getting a lot of people like that wanted to work with him, or they wanted his secrets. He kind of played it both ways with the Battlestar Galactica aspect. I mean, I think it was like he had envisioned ILM as a way to finance productions by having a in-house effects unit. But when Dykstra started working on Battlestar Galactica, he resented it because he was like, I just want, I want this stuff. Any tricks that you do, I want those for my movies. I don't want television or other people being able to benefit from your innovation before I get a chance to. And so that became this whole situation where he started becoming maybe even more protective of the work, and he wanted even less input from others. It's this idea that people were going to start fixing it in the edit. That stuff wasn't going to happen this time, which again may have led to some of the issues later on in production that he had with Irvin Kershner kind of putting stuff in the movie that he wasn't super excited about, but ultimately it worked. So it's that kind of give and take.
There was definitely a change, right? But Lucas is now in the position of kingmaker. He has shown Hollywood not only that your ways don't work anymore, but my ways are wildly successful and can produce vast riches. But I also think that a lot of the approach towards his sequel, Robert talked a lot about this stuff. A lot of it was informed by his experience in Hollywood with the sequel to American Graffiti. That was something that was beyond his control, out of his hands. He was nominally compensated for it, but it was ultimately terrible. But his name was on that in some way, and he was associated to it. And so not only does now he have the control of his own creative future, he could have gone on and done many other things, but wanting to finish the Star Wars saga, or whatever it was supposed to be, he knew that the sequel had to be as good as or better than the original. And I think that he could afford certain assistance to remove himself from some of the processes that he loathed. But again, being the hot thing in Hollywood, people were definitely made available to him, or people would want to work with him that would not have even taken a meeting with George, 3 years prior. So yeah, he's definitely different. I mean, now he's able to control a lot of processes, but he's also able to insulate himself from a lot of things, which on one hand, I guess, could be helpful, but on the other hand, we see to what extent that insulation of him produces when he gets started on making the prequels. He has now started or founded all these different companies. They are sources of revenue outside of the Star Wars cycle. I don't know to what extent, for example, the LucasArts, the game company, beyond Star Wars games, I don't know if it really produced any serious income for him as an individual, but the fact that he recognized that the money, where the money goes when it comes to, again, licensing and film production, it used to be split up amongst a lot of other companies and people. And so what he figured out was, if I own all the companies, potentially what I can do is I can do contracts with myself. I can say, okay, well, we're going to hire ILM to do our special effects for our movie, but you own ILM, so you're moving money around to yourself. There was an interview that I was watching with George Lucas, and he was talking about cameras and cameramen, and when he was getting started with all the stuff, the whole thing was the cameramen would buy all the good cameras, and then they would lease them to the production company, as well as be hired to have a salary for actually operating them. So they not only did they own the profit from their own labor, they also owned the profit from the equipment that they would be laboring on. And it was something that he observed and kind of took to heart. And one of the reasons why he created ILM is he wanted to own those specialty camera systems and what they're used for in special effects photography. So he's taking all these things that have come before, he's assimilating them into his worldview and his business leadership skills, or whatever you want to call them. And he's starting to figure out, how he's created his own, outside of the distribution system of the films themselves. He's almost created his own personal Hollywood in a way, with Lucasfilm and ILM and other things. There's definitely a change coming with George. He's now this person who is almost beyond reproach in a way, because there's no influence on him anymore. The studio can't come along and say, oh yeah, well, we don't like that scene, we want it taken out, or we're not going to distribute, or we're not going to produce, or we're not going to fund, or whatever it might be. And he's beyond that now. Everybody's coming to him and asking for his favor and good grace. And so he moves into that. He can't be the lovable loser anymore. He's the top, right? He's the king. Yet he still tries to maintain that persona publicly. But I mean, he has the massive ranch thing going on now. He's got all these companies, all these people working for him. It's like he had mentioned and joked about it later on, about how he had spent his youth fighting against the corporation, and then he ultimately became the corporation. And it's the great irony of everything. The revolutionaries, they overthrow the totalitarian regime, and then they ultimately become the totalitarian regime to preserve their power. It's the ironic cycle. George hates Hollywood and hates the system, but then he creates his own system and runs it. And the fact that he's self-aware enough to realize it even later in life is nice. I mean, he has retained a certain level of humanity after all of this, but yeah, but it's definitely a whole different animal and a whole different situation between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back.
He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil. Sorry.
That's awesome. Yeah.
When exactly does he buy the ranch?
That's a good question. He's talking about it in, again, this Mighty Starlog interview. I thought I actually highlighted this. Is the ranch all filmmaking? Are there any other arts involved? Oh, it's just like he talks about it sharing office space. So yeah, and then he talks about he wants to make his his experimental personal films again.
Still talking about it.
He kind of hits the same spots, like, I just want to make those small, personal, independent films that nobody will see. And, you'll never see them. I always love how they say that he's probably got some secret YouTube out there that nobody knows about. I'm like, yeah, I actually have a theory that, and I'm jumping the gun on this, jumping out the outline, but I think the prequels were those experimental films that he talked about, that he put a lot of those ideas into those, but that's neither here nor there. We'll get to those later.
Maybe
that's an interesting theory, though.
It is an interesting perspective to think of the prequels as the experimental films. These are my art films.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Well, look how divisive they are and non-traditional in the storytelling. They didn't even follow what the expectation of what Star Wars fans wanted. They're not like the original trilogy. It's very stylized. It's incredibly more stylized than the original trilogy. There's even weird kind of visuals. He talked about the tone poems. He used that term tone poems a lot when he talks about film, and then they weren't actually used in the film, but in the marketing, there was a whole aspect of the tone poems that he released in, like, on StarWars.com. I remember going online and having to download them over a dial-up modem, like these tone poems where he would like Liam Neeson would do something, and then Darth Maul had done one, and Padme had done one, and it was like these kind of like little poems, and then it was just a promo for the movie. It's just very kind of experimental, kind of a teaser about like, yeah, these movies are going to be way more formal than you expect. And like I don't have notes on this, but like some of the sequences, like the lament of Padme in her chambers as Anakin is deciding whether or not what he's going to do when Mace Windu tells him to stay, when they're going to confront Palpatine, and they're just sitting there and there's no dialogue and there's this creepy music, and it's just like, it's the weirdest thing in all the Star Wars movies. It's nothing that I've ever seen in a Star Wars movie. It's just like a 30-second thing where they're just kind of like looking very intently, and the music is not like any of the other music, and it's actually one of my favorite thing in all the prequels. It's just the weirdest little moment where there's no dialogue and the visuals aren't exotic or anything. You're just looking at people sitting there worrying, and it's so weird and intense. And I thought to myself, these are the kind of things, if he was just going to be like, I'm going to watch people racing boats on a river, I'm just going to put the camera there and what happens. It's something about it feels very experimental. Or maybe the dialogue was so bad that they just didn't use what they were going to say.
The nature of the prequels is quite different. We're going to talk about one era versus the other. So it's fine it's fine. I mean, jumping ahead, who cares? Yeah, this is stream of consciousness. So that's awesome. The ranch, sorry, I'd look that up before you started to talk. Yeah, 70s, purchased in 78. So he's taking that sweet New Hope money, and he pours it into a couple thousand acres in Marin County. Things are added over time, and the ranch doesn't become the ranch until mid to late 80s, and maybe one could argue the 90s, but the purchase comes immediately after A New Hope. So again, here's Lucas reinvesting in himself, that learning. We can do everything that's happening in Southern California here in Northern California and be free from the oversight and the politics and the games and the nonsense. I mean, that takes confidence. There's a lot of confidence there. And of course, with the success of New Hope, why shouldn't he have confidence? But lesser people wouldn't have shown that level of confidence. Again, that forward thinking. Sorry, Sean, you were going to say something?
I was going to kind of talk about that a little bit. I mean, with the fact that he was to the point where he was in full control, there's still that aspect of, if it does fail, he has separated himself now from the studio system, that he has no one to blame but himself if it does fail. And so he has everything in one hand, but he could potentially lose everything if that second movie doesn't hit the way the first movie did.
Right. Despite the revenue from A New Hope, the things he's doing, and in creating A New Hope, he'd worked around Marin, and for Empire, they'll be renting warehouses in San Rafael and using different spaces in the area. But now the ranch is going to create this great option for him. Eventually we'll get to the point where we have the Presidio campus. I mean, that's going to come much, much later, but he's not afraid to take these risks and put his money where his mouth is. I'm going to do this. I'm going to show you. Yeah. Really, really high degree of risk. I'm sure there were people in Southern California who were counseling him against it and maybe laughing at him behind his back. This is going to be a colossal failure. And though he has the success of A New Hope, we'll see the end of George Lucas soon. You'll be back. You'll be working for a studio before too long. Obviously, they're proven wrong.
One of the biggest movie studios, like in 1980, 1981 or whatever, United Artists kind of basically went bankrupt because they bankrolled Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate. It was like this, I can't even, I think that movie cost like $70 million even back then, which is just incredible. And it's that idea of like the studio kind of bankrolling an auteur who was just a pure filmmaker. He wasn't a mogul. He wasn't doing technologies. It was like just that apparently he was going for this super authentic kind of thing. And so they'd create these incredible sets that were only used briefly. And, he had no concept. So it's kind of like that weird dichotomy of Lucas, like took all the money he made and just reinvested it in himself, in his technologies, in the futures. Whereas like there were filmmakers out there that were getting a little bit of heat and then taking all this and just blowing through all their respectability basically by trying to create these enormous monument movies that ultimately the times are already changing. People want kind of more direct enjoyment from a film. They don't want to have a slow, building epic over 3.5 hours. The era of the blockbuster is happening, and Lucas he's almost single-handedly creating this and then cementing it with Empire. So it's kind of an interesting change. I mean, maybe it's a thing where he kind of could see that things were changing. Because again, when they first got a little bit of interest of all these young filmmakers, this kind of change. I think we talked about this in the first episode, in the kind of the lay of the land in the 60s. It was the studios and directors were old and times were changing. Peter Fonda had sponsored, and Jack Nicholson were making like Easy Rider, and people were starting to realize, okay, the times are changing. We need to get involved with these kids. And they had given a bunch of money to Francis Ford Coppola. And again, THX got made and flopped. And so it kind of made them kind of like, maybe this wasn't a great idea. But essentially, in some regards, I think that Lucas's idea for the ranch was kind of like a perfection, or not a perfection necessarily, but a refinement to make it more useful and financially advantageous. That Coppola wanted to have like this American zoetrope thing where it's like up in Napa, where it's going to be like, we're going to have this house and people are going to live there, and it's like we're all going to sit around on these big couches, and these beautiful women will bring us wine and coffee, and we're going to talk big art things, and we're going to write scripts, and we're going to and I think even though George was very much amongst these were his peers, it seems ultimately he was like, once he kind of went off and he was like, he kind of picked the best ideas, like let's go out, let's get out of Hollywood, because he'd already kind of found out that really the only benefit of Hollywood is the distribution, is to get your movies into theaters, because he'd already kind of had it run up against the Directors Guild, because at that time the way the contracts were said that actors and directors were supposed to be credited within 30 seconds of the first beginning of the movie, and and George had this concept of just no credit, just the credits of the film. And of course, the guild said, well, actually, your name is the first thing because it says Lucasfilm. And he's like, but my name isn't George Lucasfilm. That's the name of the company. So it's that kind of, he had already kind of seen that there was an opportunity to change the nature of how the studios interacted with the director and the producer. And then he sees maybe some of what Francis's ideas were, but again, Francis's idea is more of a salon idea of this conditions for creativity, then creativity will happen. And in every aspect of this, the way George does it, I feel like he's like, well, I'm going to create this thing as an aspect to finish my film, and I'm going to bring ideas to these places. I'm not going to sit around and wait for these ideas. And at the time, he's doing Star Wars movies, so the idea has already been kind of cast. But his thrust of this is to get these things done. I mean, that's, again, I need to get my films done. I need to get this one to be a success so I can make another one. I can tell my stories. And, we can debate how earnest he was, but he definitely was a forward moving thing. He had realized that, like, okay, well, the light's on me, and this is the best way to do it. And again, it's a hybridization of this for a very meat guy, a prodigious business acumen, and a bona fide hit. There've been so many times where things were hits, and then all the money people got in, and then they said, well, how can we bleed this thing dry? And then they just kind of kill it. And it's like he had already kind of made some of his big mistakes early on. So I think he was just primed to like, now is the time to make this move. And it's like, essentially, I think he took like a month off and he was right back in it. He went to Hawaii, kind of chilled out, talked about like, oh, I'm going to take a vacation. Like, apparently that was the thing. It's like, oh, I'm going to start Marsha wants me to take 2 vacations a year now. And then it's like, it happened like once, and then he was just back into it because he realized that I think this thing was he had a limited amount of time to utilize this opportunity, lest it might end up be kind of like what happened to Francis, where it was slow. He was slowly dwindling after Apocalypse Now. As much as that movie is a masterpiece, it was a real pain for everyone involved. Almost killed some of the people making it, and it frustrated the studios to no end. And I don't think it was necessarily a huge box office success. It got a ton of praise, and I think George was like, I kind of want to benefit from those ideas without the pitfalls of creating some unwieldy sequel that I can't keep control of, because I'm going to expose, I'm going to go 4 times as big, which, Empire is kind of like twice as big as Star Wars, which was manageable, even though he still had problems in funding, in production, but still it was able to swing it.
Yeah, there's the potential there for the ego to get out of control, after all that success, and to do, like you said, go 5-10 times bigger. Like, let's just, make this thing the most epic of epic. George knew, or was aware enough, or had enough experience, I guess, to know that was not the path to follow, even though probably he really wanted to. I mean, he is, after all, an artist and a creative, and he has an ego, even though he tries to keep that out of the spotlight as best he can. He definitely has an ego and a sense of self, but to not give in to that urge to show the world how great you really are now that the shackles are off, kind of a thing. That was another great business decision on George's part. Again, by keeping costs relatively low and not having to borrow too much money, he's mitigating his risk, but he's also maximizing his potential for profit. And so this, again, is now a conversation where we start to wonder, is it George wanting to get his movies made? Is it George wanting to get his creative vision out? Or does he now realize that he has the ability to make himself incredibly rich, and this vehicle of Star Wars that can take him there is something that he enjoys and is something of his own creation, but it's the golden goose in a way, right? It's this thing that's just giving him money, and it won't stop giving him money for a very long time. And so I don't know. It's a weird thing, because like George is very much 2 people. He is that quiet, introverted nerd, artist, creative person who likes photography and visual media and visual storytelling, but he's also this very astute and almost ruthless, in a way, businessman who knows how to maximize every possible angle on everything he does. And he's taken the best of everybody's ideas on how to get out of the Hollywood system, and has combined them and executed them in such a way that he is, now completely beyond the clutches of Hollywood.
Yeah, and the genre of sci-fi just explodes after Star Wars. And there's a little bit of good. Some of it's really good. But there's a whole lot of bad. Hollywood's looking at Star Wars. They still can't see it the way Lucas sees it. And they still don't understand the genius of Lucas in creating it and what makes it tick. It's narrative driven. It's not the spaceships and the special effects. They're fantastic. Far ahead of the time, really defining what movies will be from there on out. But they're looking at Star Wars and thinking, well, we all need franchises, and it's got to be action, it's got to be special effects. Totally missing the point. It's funny how for all of Star Wars' success, Lucas is still one of the few people who understands why it's successful and where he can take it. And pretty much everyone else, they can't see it for what it is.
You know, when something is successful, most people that are, you know, think like, well, how can we exploit this? And the mountain of, and sometimes you get something cheesy like Star Crash, which people might want to seek that out as kind of a fun, with like great acting by Marjoe Gortner and David Hasselhoff, and they're like, it's like the idea of like, wow, how could you completely miss the point of what was fun about Star Wars? But for everything like that, there's something that ostensibly was greenlit for cynical reasons, but ultimately turned out to be a great thing of its own, which was the movie Alien that Ron Shusett and Dan O'Bannon had some alien stuff in it, and you know, I'm sure everybody knows the plot to Alien. And Dan O'Bannon said like, well, we really benefited from the fact that we had the script ready and Star Wars had come out 2 months previously. So there are a lot of these great examples that immediately, that's the whole reason, you know, for better or worse, whatever your opinion of the film is, that it gave people the idea of like, hey, you know, I think Star Trek could work on the big screen, which essentially rejuvenated Star Trek. I mean, I don't think Star Trek would have ever come back if it hadn't, even though people talk about the conventions, or I think that would have died out eventually. I mean, I knew they were kind of in production on a TV series, and then Star Wars kind of made them realize, like, let's do it cinematically. Superman the motion picture in 1979, you know, people think about, we can tell this story seriously. We can use the heroic aspects. We can dip back into the pulp. We can talk about heroism. We can talk about good. And I got my quote fingers out. And even on a technical level, it's like, you know something, Alec Guinness was in Star Wars and it didn't ruin his career. And so Marlon Brando's like, you know, I'll take $1 million to put on a white wig and a weird suit, and I'll play it straight. I'll do it seriously. So it did create, it reached back and kind of rose up some of the stuff in that might have been kind of lost to the ages. But yes, it also spawned a lot of like bad sci-fi movies, a lot of Kirk Douglas running around in a space station level of bad. You know, then there's also stuff that's somewhere in the middle, like Sean Connery's Outland, which came out obviously after Empire, Blade Runner, and I'm trying to think of, I'm trying to strain to think about some of the more egregious Star Wars ripoff, because I used to have almost like an allergic reaction to things that, as a child, that felt like was too much of a ripoff of Star Wars, and I would just be like, I can't watch this. I don't like this. This is just a ripoff. So I don't have a lot of fond memories of those, because I just kind of like Star Crash. I'd be like, this is terrible, and I'd turn it off and walk away. So it's like I tended to kind of coast upon this naive belief that it was all good stuff, and that it just basically, you know, the rising tide rose all the boats. But yes, there was a lot of crud.
The nice thing about that, though, is the elevation of the genre of sci-fi from something that was, laughed at and laughed about completely to something that could be taken seriously. And there is of course the cynical aspect of Hollywood, and they see something make money, and there's some executive somewhere in a corner office that says, I want 5 of those by next week, because they see the money and they see that, that one studio is being more successful over their studio, and so that they have to get in on that and get that slice of the pie. But for the fans, or for the people who want those things, outside of 2001, at that point, there was a lot of people who had only been able to get their sci-fi from either TV or from the old school, the Saturday serials in the movie theater, and it was never elevated above that, and it's kind of funny, we live in an era now where streaming services are, the answer to all of our problems, and the new big thing that creates all the buzz and the cash in the industry. But at one time, television was a joke, and you would never see, air quotes, real actors ever appearing on a TV show. And so the fact that a majority of our stuff, our sci-fi stuff, was television related, kind of again shows how, what level of contempt the genre was held in Hollywood. So Star Wars, again, very much opened the eyes and the pocketbooks of studios to creating stuff that was of a higher level of quality, or at least an attempt to create something of a higher level of quality. And we talked about some of the good stuff, like Blade Runner and Alien, which was converted from it was going to be kind of a straight to, home release kind of a situation, or something along those lines. It was going to be sort of a real rough, pulpy film, and was turned into something much more elegant. I mean, yeah, it's a horror movie and it's sci-fi, but it became more elegant than what it was originally slated to be. It was going to be low budget, crappy costumes, no A-list actors. So same thing with the Star Trek. The motion picture was the entire. So Star Trek Phase 2 was in production when Star Wars came out. And it was going to be another TV show, and it was going to be, new Enterprise and different crew and all this stuff. And then Star Wars happened, and they said, well, what if we took the entire first season's budget of the TV show and we just made a motion picture? Big change, too, because, Leonard Nimoy wasn't going to do any more Star Trek. He didn't want to do it. He wasn't going to come back to the franchise. And then, ultimately they said, well, but what if it's a motion picture there, Leonard? And he's like, well, I suppose I could do that. Later on, we got Dune and stuff like that, where big budget sci-fi productions, but we also got some of the crappier things like Ice Pirates. But then you have other movies. I always forget the name of it. The Molly Ringwald movie, the whatever, and the Adventures in the Forbidden Zone or whatever. Like that movie was
Space Hunter.
Space Hunter. Okay, there you go. That movie was like medium budget, but was kind of laughable at execution. But these people now have been allowed to experiment with these things, or at least get them out into the marketplace and let the public judge them. But before that, that door was closed. So definitely, Star Wars did a lot to mainstream sci-fi, to elevate the genre to something worthy of consideration as real art or cinema. Yeah, you're going to get the bad with the good. Not every Western is awesome. Not every crime drama is awesome. Not every romantic comedy is romantic or comedic. But you have these things now, and people are allowed to play in those sandboxes. And finally getting sci-fi to be a seat at the table was huge. And for whatever else you want to say about George Lucas, that was basically him doing that.
Yeah, without a doubt. But so few people look at the film and think that could have been a Western, or that could have been a gangster film, in the universality of the themes and the interaction of the characters, the hero's journey. Like, are you fans? Are you both fans of Battlestar Galactica? Did you follow it when it came out? Did you like it?
I loved it.
I did. I enjoyed the original one. That was appointment viewing as a kid on TV. Yeah, we watched that whole series. The second one was trash, but
oh yeah.
Yeah, but that was it was really good.
Yeah, interesting. And I know that it hit at the right time, and space and ships, and the story wasn't terrible, but I could never get into it because the quality was so poor, and it felt so closely connected. Like you were talking about what constitutes a ripoff. Obviously there was legal action, but I could never get into Battlestar Galactica because it felt to me too much like it was trying to be Star Wars. You can probably both make some convincing arguments against what I just said, but that was always my perception of it at the time. It's like, yeah, I tried it. Some of the stuff's cool. Yeah, the Cylons, but it just felt to me like cheap Star Wars.
As far as like the idea of, the warrior aspect, it's kind of like, well, if you were going to just take a movie and take the whole last 20 minutes of A New Hope and go, well, let's make a TV series based off of the pilots. Those are everybody loved the pilots. Let's make a show off of that. Although, you had the Apollo, who is like the son of the head of everything, and he was a goody two shoes, and then his best friend was kind of a womanizing rogue. Those aspects, but those are aspects that happened in westerns or Bonanza, that kind. It wasn't anything that was specifically. I always kind of found that Lucas's objections to Battlestar Galactica were a little bit petty. It's like maybe it's a situation where he wanted to do this story, and it's that situation. If everybody starts copying your thing, ultimately you're going to maybe deaden or weaken the appetite for the general public. Galactica had a lot of fun aspects to it. It's ultimately the problem with that was it was actually almost as expensive as Star Wars. It was like, I think it was essentially $1 million an episode TV series in 1979. And so the whole reason it got canceled wasn't because people didn't like it. It's just they couldn't afford it to fail at the amount they were spending. It's like they weren't able to recoup enough to make it worthwhile. And, second seasons sometimes become even more expensive. And it's, I think there's like 23 episodes or something like that. So they're $23 million. So, that, and unfortunately, because of how bad the second season, which isn't really the second season, it in some ways marred the way people felt about the first. But I still, occasionally they'll show up. You can watch them on a streaming thing. And again, they're very, very much tied to kind of almost mini movies. Like for a show that was only on one season, it had a ton of, two-parters. So there was like a lot of mini movies. But yeah, the storytelling was not on par with Star Wars. It was a very much like, how can we retell Guns of the Navarone but with our characters? How can we do Murder on the Orient Express but with our characters? So yes, it had a lot of the sci-fi trappings, but yeah, ultimately it kind of folded under weak storytelling and personal growth. Character growth in a television show is like kind of ridiculous because things kind of had to reset to zero every episode because things got showed once. It wasn't even like a situation where a movie where some intrepid kid could take his paper route money and go watch Star Wars 5 times a week the entire time it was running. It's like, Battlestar Galactica played on Sunday at 7, and if you're at grandma's and you missed half of it, that was the only time you were going to see it until years after it had been canceled. So I felt like in a lot of ways it was probably a little too ambitious for what it was. Yeah, it might have actually worked better as like a series of TV movies over a couple of years rather than trying to go to full series. And I could understand that. I guess, like I said before, it's Lucas tried to sue, but I think it got Frank Herbert sued, and then they all kind of realized that like technically you guys are all right, but it'd be like a circular firing squad where you all just be suing each other over things that you had stolen from people that have that died in the 20s, so they all kind of, ultimately I think those cases were either settled or abandoned.
Yeah, I thought that the original Battlestar Galactica was I didn't have a problem with it. I didn't think it was a Star Wars ripoff. I thought it was just like it was like a lot of other shows, like the original Star Trek. It was kind of space drama. It was about a bunch of people and their relationships, and they're on a quest, and it happens to be in space. And the visuals on it were great. I loved the ships. I loved the Cylons, all that stuff that was so cool. But again, it was just another TV drama, right? Star Trek was, especially Next Generation or whatever. It was just like 7 seasons of soap opera. Everybody's got their personal problems, and there's all this stuff, and there's conflict, and we got to resolve it, and people are getting married, and all this, whatever. It was a soap opera, but it was sci-fi enough that it was, again, appointment viewing. The same thing with Battlestar Galactica. It's just, Robert nailed it when he said that its reach exceeded its grasp, and it was just too ambitious for the time.
What were your opinions of Buck Rogers?
Beady. Pretty good. I mean, the thing is like that, you're talking about my wheelhouse. That was like, as a Star Wars kid, kind of saturated in this time when all this stuff was coming out. It's like, I enjoyed that. Obviously it had a lighter tone. Basically the same people were involved in that production. It kind of backslid to being kind of a second-rate Star Trek ripoff of putting him on a ship and then having adventures of the week. And I honestly thought it was a bit more fun in the first season, where it was a bit more pulpy, and Buck there was a lot more comedy in it. I guess apparently much to the chagrin of some of the people that were acting on it, and they didn't like it. And so it was kind of, this episode, it's got Buster Crabbe, the original Buck Rogers, which, I've never been a person that ever went back and watched those old serials with any kind of joy. I mean, I definitely had seen them because they tried to drag them out when Star Wars came out and said, "You like Star Wars, kid? You're going to love Flash Gordon." And it's like, no, I'm not, because it looked terrible. So they would have like actors that were like big deals to like maybe my parents as guest stars, and you'd be like, yeah, sorry man, Cesar Romero's just not cutting it for me. So there was always that kind of aspect that was a little bit weird, but ultimately I enjoyed that first season is a lot of fun.
I enjoyed it as well. The Buck Rogers situation, that was important in our household. My dad was a big fan of Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, the old, comic strips and the old serials. We had those serials on VHS at one point, watched them a lot. And again, recognizing them for what they are. I mean, they're 1930s sci-fi films. So obviously the toilet paper tube with the sparkler hanging out the back end is supposed to be a rocket. It's like, okay, I get that. Special effects, some special effects don't hold up over time, and it is what it is. But the Buck Rogers show, the new one from that time, it was good. It was another thing we watched a lot. But yeah, it had a different feel. There was a lot more comedy in it than Battlestar Galactica. I mean, Battlestar Galactica had its moments, but it did feel more fun. It felt like more lighthearted adventure, I guess. I mean, there was some serious stuff, and there was some weirdness in there and some creepy things, but it more leaned towards its pulp origins than trying to become high art or serious television. But yeah, I enjoyed all of it. I thought, I'm a nerd kid, a Star Wars kid, grew up on all that nerdy stuff. So, give me all you can.
It's another show that I didn't like. I say I didn't like it. I watched, I don't know how many episodes. It was only on for 2 seasons, but I was watching it from time to time. It might have had something to do with Aaron Gray, so I saw enough of it. I guess I was exposed to the advertising that was supporting the show. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, there was a lot of complicated feelings about that show because it's
yes,
Marky Post. I could just name them all. It's like
Yes, there there was spandex, and there was midriffs and short skirts, and that's
Even
a whole
Gil
nother show.
Even
Sorry,
Gil Gerard had to wear that like skin tight suit, and you could tell, like you could see sometimes the straps of the girdle he was wearing. So he was having to squeeze himself into spandex too. So it was even progressive for its time.
Yeah, it's like the guys wearing skirts in the premiere episode of Star Trek Next Generation, right?
Right. And then never to be seen again.
Correct.
Looking at the time, are we staring down the barrel of part 3?
I think we are, aren't we?
Yeah, I think yeah.
I mean, that's not in question. I kind of realized, I was like, oh man, we're doing part 3. This is gonna be epic. You need to charge money for this.
Trilogy.
Put it behind the paywall.
I could have a drink and then I'll come back and then you can have your Patreon level stuff.
Totally. Yeah. I still think we should do a Galactic Initiative After Dark episode where we're
Dude, that's
unhinged.
right there. All right, so part 2 of our George Lucas discussion has come to an end, and of course, thank you, Sean.
It has the patina of immaculate realism.
Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome. I got nothing to follow.
You should do it in your Harrison Ford voice, man.
Yeah. I've got nothing. Kill me. I don't want to play this guy anymore. Kill me.
Galactic Initiative is not authorized or endorsed by Lucasfilm Limited. The name Star Wars and all related materials are registered trademarks of Lucasfilm Limited, a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, all rights reserved. Galactic Initiative is a registered trademark, and other product and company names are trademarks of their respective holders. Use does not imply affiliation or endorsement.